Airports are places of passage, where lives intersect only for a moment before scattering to the corners of the world. Most travelers move quickly, consumed by itineraries, deadlines, and the restless rhythm of departure boards. Yet, every so often, an ordinary gate becomes the stage for something extraordinary. It was supposed to be a simple flight. A black CEO, polished and poised, arrived not to make headlines but to journey from one city to another. Her ticket was valid, her credentials unquestionable, her presence unmistakable. Yet when she approached the counter to take her rightful seat in first class, she was met not with recognition, but with resistance. At first, it seemed like a small slight, one of those countless travel frustrations passengers endure. But this was different. This was not about seating charts or overbooking. It was about dignity, about the quiet but unmistakable message of who is seen as belonging and who is not. Within minutes, the denial of a single seat became something larger. The air thickened with tension, and murmurs rose among strangers who moments before had been bound only by shared impatience. Cameras tilted upward. Voices stirred. What began as an act of dismissal ignited into a confrontation that neither the airline staff nor the passengers could have anticipated. And there, at Gate 14, an unlikely transformation unfolded, not just of policy, but of people. The boarding gate was crowded that morning, just another ordinary day, just another flight. Yet, in the quiet hum of rolling suitcases and the call of boarding groups, a moment unfolded that tested not only the dignity of one woman, but the conscience of all who bore witness. She was a CEO, brilliant, composed, a woman who had built her future from nights of study, from sacrifices unseen by the world, from the kind of grit that only comes when you refuse to be defined by limits. She carried herself with calm certainty, but when she approached the jet bridge, the attendant looked her over and shook their head. First class? Not you. Not you? It was not said outright, but it was written in the tone, the glance, the smirk that dismissed her presence. She was told to step aside, as though her ticket and her worth had been invalidated by the simple fact of who she was. Some passengers turned away, unwilling to intervene. Others shifted uncomfortably, and yet one small spark was ignited in that moment. A man in the coach, a teacher from Detroit, stood up and quietly said, "She has the right. Look at her ticket." A young mother cradling her child whispered, "Let her through." And like that, ordinary people began to rise, not with anger, but with unity. What happened next was not chaos. It was conscience refusing to stay silent. Within 30 minutes, the entire cabin had become a chorus of voices demanding fairness, dignity, and respect. The airline staff, overwhelmed not by disorder but by a collective insistence on decency, had no choice but to act. Policies were re-examined, apologies demanded, and the truth was laid bare. One woman's unjust denial had awakened the courage of many. This is not simply a story about a seat on a plane. This is about something larger, about how dignity cannot be checked like baggage. It is about the belief that when one person is diminished, we are all diminished, and when one person rises, we all rise. Think of the teacher who spoke up, though he had no stake in the matter. Think of the mother who balanced her child in her arms and still found the strength to defend a stranger. These were not powerful people in the conventional sense. They had no titles, no corporate authority. Yet, in that moment, they embodied leadership. They showed us that extraordinary change often begins with ordinary people who refuse to remain silent. We live in a world where injustice can wear many disguises, sometimes quiet, sometimes blatant. But we also live in a world where courage multiplies when it is shared, where unity is born in small acts of conscience, where hope is not a distant promise but a present choice. So tonight, let this story remind us, change does not always come from grand speeches or great halls. Sometimes it begins at a boarding gate, in a simple act of standing up for what is right. To the woman denied her seat, to the passengers who stood beside her, to every person who has ever felt unseen. Know this: your worth is not determined by the doubts of others. Your place in the world is not granted by permission. It is claimed through perseverance, dignity, and the courage to keep walking forward. The future we seek, the one filled with fairness, respect, and hope, belongs to all of us. But it demands something of us too. It calls on us to act, to speak, to rise for one another when silence would be easier. Because when we stand together, even in the most ordinary of places, we can transform a moment of exclusion into a movement of inclusion. And so I leave you with this: never forget that your voice matters. Never underestimate the power of unity. Never doubt that the future can be brighter. Because it is written not by the few, but by the many who dare to believe in better. The seat denied became a symbol reclaimed. The chaos became clear, and the story became proof of what we can achieve when we choose to rise together. The airport terminal hummed with its usual rhythm, the steady drag of rolling suitcases across polished floors, the muffled announcements echoing from speakers, the distant laughter of families setting off on long, awaited trips. For most, it was an ordinary morning, one more checkpoint between departure and arrival. But for her, this day carried a quiet symbolism. She was not merely traveling, she was moving forward in every sense of the word. The black woman who stood near the gate was no ordinary passenger. She was a CEO, self-made, disciplined, carved out of resilience and vision. Her presence carried the calm authority of someone who had spent years proving herself in boardrooms where few looked like her. Every step she took was built on sacrifices that stretched back generations, sacrifices that whispered of ancestors who dreamed of a future she now embodied. She held her boarding pass in her hand, first class. Not a gift, not a favor, but her rightful purchase, earned through nights of labor, through decisions that weighed heavy but necessary, through persistence when doors were slammed in her face. To her, the seat was not just leather and legroom. It was a symbol, a hard, one place in spaces where she had often been told she did not belong. She approached the gate with a dignified ease, offering a brief, polite smile to the attendant. The scan of the ticket should have been a simple moment, small beep granting her passage into a journey like any other. But instead, there was hesitation. The attendant's eyes flickered, not to the ticket, but to her face. A brief pause, imperceptible to some, heavy with meaning to those who had lived it before. The words came, calm on the surface, sharp underneath. "Ma'am, this is the line for first class." She looked down at her ticket, then back up, her voice steady, measured. "Yes, this is my boarding pass." But the attendant's tone did not shift. The smirk lingered, the doubt unmasked. "There must be a mistake. You'll need to step aside while we sort this out." It was in that moment that silence fell heavier than noise. Passengers behind her shuffled uncomfortably, some glancing at their phones, others pretending not to notice. A few looked on with curiosity, as if watching a scene play out on a stage, uncertain if they were permitted to intervene. Her chest tightened, not from surprise. She had seen moments like this before, but from the sharp sting of repetition. It was not the denial of the seat itself, but the denial of recognition, of belonging, of worthiness. She had lived her life breaking ceilings and building bridges, yet still she stood in a line where her presence was questioned as though success had limits set by others. The attendant motioned for another passenger to move ahead. She was asked to wait, to prove herself once again. Each second that passed felt like a test. Would she raise her voice? Would she retreat? Would she comply with the quiet erosion of her dignity? She chose none of these. She stood still, poised, her face unreadable yet filled with quiet fire. The boarding pass remained in her hand, a testament to her truth. In the glass of the terminal window, her reflection met her gaze, a reminder of the countless battles she had endured to stand in this very place. The denial was not loud, not publicized, not recorded for headlines. It was subtle, ordinary, easy to overlook by those untouched by it. But for her, it was monumental. It carried the weight of every time she had been asked to wait, to prove, to justify her existence in spaces already rightfully hers. The gate remained open, the flight crew bustled in and out. Around her, life continued. Yet, in that small corner of the terminal, the air had changed. What should have been a moment of seamless passage had become a moment heavy with meaning, a microcosm of struggle carried silently by too many for too long. The murmur of the terminal softened as the moment unfolded. A woman holding a first-class ticket was told to wait. It was not loud, not theatrical, yet something in the air shifted, the way a room changes when a candle is suddenly blown out. Silence, subtle and suffocating, descended over those close enough to witness. Passengers behind her froze, caught in the unease of bystanders. A businessman with a briefcase cleared his throat, pretending to scroll through his phone, his eyes darting between the attendant and the woman, unsure whether to intervene or to retreat into the safety of his own world. A teenage boy with headphones lowered the volume, curiosity sparking across his face, as though he sensed an injustice, but lacked the words to name it. A mother bouncing her infant on her shoulder looked away quickly, whispering something soothing to her child, yet her grip tightened in an unspoken recognition of the tension pressing against her chest. It was not simply that she was being denied her seat. It was the way it happened. The hesitation, the tone, the unspoken assumption that she did not belong where her ticket said she did. Those who saw it, truly saw it, could not escape the feeling that something about this was deeply wrong. And yet, most remained silent. Silence can be louder than words. The unspoken questions grew heavy. Why her? Why now? What made the attendant pause? None of the questions were asked aloud, but they rippled through the space, gathering weight with each second that passed. The CEO stood motionless, her boarding pass still in hand, her posture unshaken. She did not plead, did not argue. Her silence was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of endurance, of 1,000 moments like this compressed into one. It was the silence of someone who had fought too many battles to waste breath on every gatekeeper who doubted her worth. Some passengers wanted to speak, but fear restrained them. The businessman feared losing his composure in front of colleagues he might encounter later. The mother feared drawing attention while holding her child. The teenage boy feared being dismissed as knave, and so the silence deepened, not out of agreement, but out of hesitation. Yet hesitation carries its own kind of weight. For in the heart of that silence lay a moral test, one that often comes unannounced, dressed not in grand moments, but in the quiet unfairness of everyday life. The test was simple: would anyone stand, or would everyone remain seated in their comfort? The attendant moved briskly, waving through the next passenger with ease, her eyes sliding past the woman as though she had already been erased from the order of boarding. The woman, however, did not move aside. Her presence alone disrupted the rhythm of the line, her stillness commanding more attention than raised voices ever could. A man in the far corner lowered his newspaper. His brows furrowed as he studied the scene, but he too remained fixed in place, as though gauging whether his voice could matter in this crowded stage. A young girl, no older than 9, tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why can't she go?" The mother shushed her gently, avoiding the truth that lingered in plain sight. The shock in that moment was not explosive. It was quiet, creeping, almost invisible to those who did not know how to see it. Yet, for those who felt it, the teacher sitting 3 rows back, the veteran with years of discipline in his spine, the student with restless energy, it struck with force. It was the kind of shock that does not vanish quickly, the kind that lingers long after the moment itself has passed. The woman's expression remained calm, but her silence spoke volumes. She had lived long enough to know that silence can reveal the character of a room. Sometimes it reveals courage, sometimes it reveals fear, and sometimes it reveals the thin line between the two. Her fingers rested on the boarding pass, the ink on it undeniable, her name printed clearly, her class of travel unmistakable. Still, she waited encircled by silence, the weight of others' inaction pressing invisibly on her shoulders. The terminal resumed its hum, the clicking of heels on tile, the call of another flight echoing in the distance. But for those who stood within a few steps of the gate, the hum could not drown the truth. They had witnessed a moment that demanded something more than silence, yet silence was all that filled the air. The silence stretched on, fragile yet suffocating. People shifted in place, pretending not to notice, while every second that ticked by carved the moment deeper into memory. The woman remained still, dignified, her first-class ticket pressed between her fingers like both evidence and shield. The attendant, calm in her authority, turned her attention to the next passenger as though the woman were invisible, and then, from behind the line, a voice broke the silence. It was not thunderous, it was not dramatic, it was ordinary, measured, steady, carrying neither anger nor accusation, but an unmistakable clarity. "Excuse me," the man said. Heads turned, some with surprise, some with relief that someone had spoken at last. He was not remarkable at first glance. A teacher, traveling with nothing more than a worn leather bag and a folder of papers he had been grading on the way to the airport. His suit jacket was simple, his tie slightly askew. He was not wealthy, not powerful, not the kind of figure one might expect to shift the energy of a room. But what he carried was rarer than any title: courage in the face of indifference. He stepped forward, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "She has the right to board. Her ticket says first class." The attendant blinked, caught off guard. The passengers around them froze, their silence now punctuated by the undeniable truth spoken aloud. The teacher's voice was not raised, but it carried across the space, the way a stone tossed into still water ripples outward farther than anyone expects. The woman turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, there was recognition, not of him as a person, but of what he represented. She saw in him the courage she had long carried within herself, now reflected back at her through an ordinary man who decided silence was no longer an option. Others stirred. The teenage boy who had lowered his headphones earlier glanced up, his curiosity sparking into conviction. The mother holding her child looked over, torn between her instinct to stay invisible and her growing realization that her child would one day ask her who she chose to be in moments like these. The teacher's voice had opened a door. His words, so simple, had reframed the silence. It was no longer a vacuum of fear and hesitation. It was now a space filled with possibility. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, her authority faltering in the face of unexpected resistance. She tried to maintain composure, insisting that the procedure was being followed, that nothing was wrong. But the ordinary man's words had already cut through the veil. They had named the unspoken injustice, and once named, it could not be ignored. Passengers whispered now, their voices threading through the air. "She has a first-class ticket. Why won't they let her through? That's not right." The murmurs, once restrained, began to gather momentum, their weight growing with every second. The woman herself remained poised, her posture unchanged, her silence still steady. But within her, something shifted too. She had spent her life carrying battles alone, her dignity often her only armor. Now, for the first time in this small corner of the terminal, stood beside her, not in title, not in wealth, but in humanity. The teacher adjusted his glasses, his voice steady as he added, "We teach children every day that fairness matters. If we cannot live by it ourselves, then what are we teaching them?" It was not a speech. It was not rehearsed. It was simply truth spoken at the right moment by someone who had nothing to gain and everything to risk in choosing to speak. The silence had been cracked open. The spell of indifference had been broken. One voice had risen, ordinary in every sense, yet extraordinary in its courage to stand when everyone else chose to sit. The air thickened, not with noise but with the possibility of change, carried forward by the courage of a man who decided that his silence was no longer enough. The teacher's words hung in the air like a spark suspended in darkness. They were not shouted, not charged with anger, yet they carried more weight than volume ever could. For a moment, the terminal seemed to inhale, every eye glancing toward him, every ear catching the unmistakable clarity of truth spoken plainly. And then, something shifted. A woman, near the back of the line, adjusted the baby in her arms. She had kept her gaze low before, whispering soft lullabies to quiet the infant, hoping the tension would dissolve without drawing her in. But now, with the teacher's words echoing, her voice lifted. Not strong at first, but steady enough. "He's right," she said, rocking her child against her shoulder. "Her ticket says first class. She should be allowed to board." It was a small sentence, simple as breath. Yet it added weight to the teacher's stand. Her child stirred slightly, pressing its cheek into her neck, and in that moment, she seemed to understand that the example she set here mattered far more than her comfort in staying silent. The ripple widened. A college student, backpack slung over one shoulder, stepped closer. His eyes flicked between the CEO, the teacher, and the attendant. He had been raised on stories of protest, on lessons about standing for what was right, but he had rarely been tested in real time. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but it was enough. "Let her through. She has every right." The attendant stiffened, her composure faltering. She opened her mouth to respond, but the growing wave of voices drowned out the sharp edge of her authority. From a seat nearby, an elderly man in a veteran's cap slowly rose. His movements were measured, his spine curved with the weight of years, yet when he stood, The room seemed to notice. He did not raise his voice, but his presence alone was its own statement. He gave a simple nod toward the woman at the gate and said, with quiet conviction, "She's earned her place. Let her have it." The ripple became a tide. Passengers who had once looked away now leaned forward. Conversations sparked between strangers, words of agreement, murmurs of support. Had weighed so heavily moments before was dissolving, replaced by a chorus of voices, ordinary people shedding the cloak of hesitation. The CEO herself remained composed, her posture a pillar of grace. She had not asked for anyone's defense, had not called for their voices. But now, watching as courage spread from one to another, she saw something remarkable. Proof that dignity could not only be defended by the one who carried it, but also protected by those who recognized its worth. The teacher glanced around, surprised at how quickly the energy had shifted. He had spoken without expectation, believing perhaps his words would fade into the air. Yet now he saw a mother, a student, a veteran, each lending strength to a stand he thought he was taking alone. The attendant's face hardened, her attempts to maintain authority slipping as the chorus grew. She repeated phrases like policy and procedure, but they rang hollow against the rising tide of human conscience. What she faced was not chaos but clarity, voices aligned not by rehearsed slogans or coordinated effort, but by the shared conviction that fairness mattered. It spread further. A man in a business suit, who earlier had buried himself in his phone, now lifted his head and spoke. "This is wrong," he said simply. "What can all see it?" Every new voice emboldened the next. Each word added to the rhythm, each act of courage lessening the fear of speaking out. What had begun as silence broken by a single teacher had now become something else entirely. A gathering of ordinary individuals discovering the strength of their collective conscience. The moment no longer belonged to the attendant, nor even to the airline. It belonged to the people standing, their voices weaving together into something stronger than authority could contain. It was not anger that fueled them, but unity. It was not a disorder, but resolved. And in that swelling resolve, courage spread like fire catching wind. The murmurs had grown into a steady current, voices rising one after another until the air inside the gate seemed charged with conviction. What had started with a teacher's quiet interruption was now a collective awakening. Each passenger, once content to remain invisible, now found themselves pulled into something greater than the boarding process of a single flight. The mother with her infant adjusted the strap of her diaper bag, speaking again with more strength in her voice. "If this happened to me," she said, "hope someone would stand for me." Her words resonated with a truth that pierced through the noise. She was not asking for confrontation. She was asking for decency, the kind that binds strangers into a community when fairness is on the line. The student added his agreement, his voice steadier now than before. "This isn't just about a seat. It's about respect. She deserves it." His backpack sagged against one shoulder, his youthful uncertainty replaced with the kind of conviction that only comes when principle outweighs fear. The veteran lifted his chin, his weathered hands resting on the handle of his cane. He did not need to say more, for his earlier words had already given weight to the gathering tide. Yet his presence, upright and unflinching, lent the crowd a kind of quiet authority, and as though generations of struggle stood embodied in him. Even those who had hesitated longest began to add their voices. The businessman, who earlier had buried his attention in a glowing phone screen, straightened in his pressed suit. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried the cadence of boardrooms and contracts. Rules exist for order, yes, but order without fairness is not order at all. It's an imbalance. The attendant shifted, her composure unraveling as the tide grew stronger. Her clipped words, "Sir, please take your seat, madam. You'll need to wait," were drowned beneath the steady chorus of disagreement. Authority, once so certain, was being tested not by rebellion but by resolve. The CEO remained silent, her composure unbroken, her hand still resting lightly on the boarding pass. Yet in her silence the passengers found focus. She was not asking for sympathy, nor demanding recognition. Her very presence, the calm dignity of someone who had earned her place 1,000 times over, was enough to anchor the voices gathering around her. There is a rare kind of strength that comes when strangers stand together, not out of personal gain, but out of shared conviction. It is not the loudness of one voice, but the harmony of many that transforms a room. The teacher could feel it, the way his words had sparked something far beyond himself. The mother sensed it too, as her child nestled more calmly against her chest, soothed by the rhythm of voices united in purpose. Whispers had become declarations. Declarations became insistence. And insistence, bound together, became undeniable. The gate, once a place of order and routine, had transformed into something more, a small stage upon which unity revealed its power. People who minutes earlier had been strangers, travelers from different states, different lives, different struggles, now stood bound by a single belief that dignity could not be denied without resistance. The ordinary had become extraordinary. A teacher, a mother, a student, a veteran, a businessman. None of them had sought the spotlight. Yet, when one voice broke the silence, the others followed, and in their unity, they discovered the kind of strength that could not be ignored. The attendant tried again, fumbling for authority, insisting that procedures must be followed, that nothing unusual was taking place. But her words rang hollow now. The crowd was no longer passive, no longer watching. They had found their voice, and together that voice carried more force than any policy could restrain. It was not chaos. It was not a disorder. It was unity, raw, human, undeniable. The unity rising at the gate unsettled the stillness that authority had long relied upon. What had begun as a routine denial was now a gathering of conscience, and the attendant, sensing her grip loosening, tried to reassert control. Her voice sharpened, her gestures clipped, as though volume and repetition could rebuild what silence and unity had already dismantled. "Please," she said, her tone firm, "step aside so others can board. We'll sort this out after." But the words did not land with the force she expected. Where once passengers might have nodded, hurried through the line, and ignored the injustice, now they stood still. Their eyes followed her every movement, their silence no longer passive but watchful, protective. Each repeated phrase from her lips seemed thinner than the last, her authority unraveling with each attempt to cloak the situation in the language of procedure and policy. Frustration crept into her voice. She glanced toward the uniformed staff stationed near the counter, signaling for support. Soon, another attendant arrived, a man whose posture carried the rigid confidence of someone accustomed to compliance. His voice was steady, rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need everyone to remain calm and follow the boarding process. There is no issue here." But there was an issue. It stood at the front of the line in the form of a woman holding a first-class ticket, her poise unshaken, her right undisputed. No matter how smoothly the words rolled off his tongue, no announcement could disguise the truth that everyone could see. Still, he persisted. Authority often resists, not because it is certain, but because it fears the cracks in its own foundation. He repeated phrases about safety, about order, about delays. The language of authority is often coded in concern, but the passengers, now emboldened, recognized the difference between genuine guidance and an attempt to silence. The teacher's jaw tightened as he listened. The mother rocked her child, gently, but her gaze never wavered. The student leaned forward, as though bracing himself for the next test. The veteran's eyes narrowed, sharp with the memory of battles fought not only on foreign soil, but within his own country's borders for dignity and respect. Authority escalated. A supervisor appeared, clipboard in hand, her expression a mask of patience stretched thin. She spoke in measured tones, addressing the passengers as though they were restless children in need of calming. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said. "We will resolve this once everyone else is seated." But the passengers did not scatter. They did not retreat into compliance. Unity had already taken root, and every attempt to diminish it only fed its resolve. The CEO, still silent, watched as authority layered itself in words, in titles, in procedures. She recognized the pattern. She had seen it in boardrooms where her expertise was questioned, in negotiations where her presence was doubted, in decisions where her leadership was second-guessed. She knew that resistance from authority was rarely about truth. It was about maintaining control, even at the cost of fairness. The attendants conferred in hushed tones, their faces tight with urgency. Calls were made on radios. More staff hovered near the gate, their presence meant to intimidate, to remind passengers of the imbalance of power. Yet the sight of more uniforms only deepened the passengers' conviction that what they were witnessing was not a misunderstanding, but an injustice being enforced. The atmosphere thickened. Every word from authority became heavier, not lighter. "Remain calm," or "step aside," sounded less like reassurance and more like desperation. The crowd felt it. They sensed the crack in the veneer, the tremor beneath the surface of authority trying to mask its fragility. Passengers shifted closer, their stance not confrontational but unyielding. The line no longer flowed forward as planned. The rhythm of boarding had been broken, and with it, the illusion that authority alone could dictate the terms of dignity. The CEO remained still at the center, the eye of the storm, her silence more powerful than the clipped instructions. Surrounding her, she had no need to argue, for the resistance of authority was already being undone. Not by shouting, not by conflict, but by the steady, growing presence of unity that refused to step aside. Amid the rising voices, the shuffle of uniforms, and the clipped tones of authority, she stood still. Her posture was calm, her shoulders relaxed yet steady, her face composed with the kind of control that does not come naturally but is built over years of practice. The black CEO at the center of the storm carried herself as though she had been here before, not at an airport gate, perhaps, but in moments where her very right to stand, to lead, to belong had been questioned. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not wave her boarding pass in protest. Her silence was deliberate, her restraint purposeful. In that silence, she conveyed something far stronger than defiance. She conveyed dignity. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd, acknowledging those who had spoken on her behalf, resting briefly on the teacher, who had first dared to break the silence, on the mother swaying gently with her infant, on the student clutching his backpack as though his own place in the world depended on this stand. She gave them nothing more than a glance, but in that glance lay gratitude, recognition, and strength shared without words. Every detail of her demeanor seemed to carry weight. Her tailored suit, pressed and precise, spoke of discipline and intention. The small leather case at her side, worn from years of travel, whispered of countless boardrooms and long nights that had brought her here. Even the way she held her boarding pass, steady, unshaken, fingers relaxed rather than clenched, was a declaration that she would not be moved by humiliation. The attendants pressed forward with their insistence, layering explanations about procedure, repeating their demands for her to step aside, but her poise rendered their words hollow. She did not meet sharpness with sharpness. She did not crumble beneath the weight of their authority. She simply stood silent and unyielding, embodying the truth that dignity does not require permission. Passengers felt it. Her composure gave them something to hold on to. It reminded them that this was not a scene of anger or chaos, but of principle. They had seen her denied, yes, but they also saw her refuse to let that denial diminish her. She stood not as a victim, but as a leader, even when leadership meant saying nothing at all. A young boy sitting with his father nearby leaned forward, whispering, "She looks like a queen." His father nodded. Unable to put to words the lesson his son was witnessing, that true power is not loud, but steady. The CEO's thoughts drifted inward for a moment. She remembered late nights studying under dim light, when exhaustion threatened to overtake her, but she pressed on anyway. She remembered the first time she walked into a boardroom where every face turned toward her with surprise that she was the one in charge. She remembered contracts won and contracts lost, and the battles fought not only for profit but for respect. Every piece of that journey rested on her shoulders now, grounding her in this moment. Her silence was not a weakness. It was a strategy. She had long ago learned that those who underestimate her strength often reveal their own fragility in the process. By standing firm, by refusing to be rattled, she gave space for the truth to surface, not just for her, but for those who now rallied beside her. Her eyes flickered briefly to the attendants, not with hostility, but with a kind of calm that unsettled them more than defiance ever could. It was the calm of someone who knew her worth so deeply that no gate, no policy, no denial could erase it. The crowd drew strength from her presence. Where authority tried to paint the scene as disorder, her composure proved otherwise. Where doubt tried to creep in, her stillness shut it out. She stood not merely for herself, but as a symbol for everyone who had ever been told to wait, to step aside, to accept less than what they had rightfully earned. Whereas her poise became the anchor of the moment. It steadied the passengers, unsettled the attendants, and transformed the gate into more than a checkpoint for boarding. Without speaking a word, she reminded everyone watching that true leadership does not always require speeches or raised voices. Sometimes it requires only the courage to remain unshaken when the world tries to deny you. The gate area had become a theater of contrasts, authority insisting on order, passengers calling for fairness, and in the center, the CEO radiating a silence that spoke louder than any voice raised. The attendants repeated their phrases like lines rehearsed too many times. Please remain calm. We're following procedure. This will be resolved later. But each repetition rang thinner than the last. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance began to shift. It started with murmurs, low and steady, passengers echoing one another's words. A teacher's declaration had cracked the silence, but now the voices moved in harmony, no longer scattered whispers, but a chorus rising with conviction. The mother, the student, the veteran, the businessman, they had spoken already, but others who had stood hesitant found themselves swept into the tide. A young woman with headphones pulled them from her ears and said clearly, "We all see what's happening." A middle-aged man clasped his boarding pass between his hands and muttered, "This isn't right," loud enough for the attendants to hear. The voices layered atop one another, building a rhythm. It was not chaos. It was order of a different kind, the order that comes when people decide that truth outweighs convenience. The attendants stiffened. They called for a supervisor. Another uniform appeared at the counter, clipboard in hand, radio clipped to her belt. She wore the expression of someone prepared to impose authority, but as she scanned the room, she realized the task before her was larger than calming an individual passenger. It was facing down a crowd united not by anger, but by conscience. She spoke carefully, measured and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. We need to continue boarding. This delay will affect everyone." Her words attempted to appeal to reason, but the passengers were unmoved. For once, their collective focus was not on schedules or connections or personal inconvenience. It was on the injustice unfolding before their eyes. A woman seated near the window rose, her voice carrying across the room. "No, what affects everyone is when one person is treated unfairly." Applause broke out, brief, scattered, but undeniable. It startled the attendants more than shouting would have. Applause is contagious, a signal of alignment. It told the staff, and each passenger, that the room was no longer fragmented individuals but a unified body. The teacher felt the swell of energy, stronger than when he had first spoken. The mother adjusted her baby's blanket, her voice firm now, no trace of hesitation. "We're not moving until she does." The veteran tapped his cane once against the floor, a sound that cut through the noise like a drumbeat. His nod alone was enough to steady those who still wavered, so the tide turned. What began as scattered voices had become a stance. It was no longer about whether the woman would board, it was about whether decency itself would prevail. The attendants exchanged anxious glances. Their clipped confidence cracked under the weight of so many eyes. Radios crackled with urgent whispers. Somewhere down the jet bridge, the captain was alerted. Somewhere in the terminal, a manager was summoned. What had begun as a single denial of passage was spiraling into a reckoning that authority could no longer contain with procedure alone. Through it all, the CEO remained steady. She had not spoken, she had not demanded. She had simply endured, a mirror reflecting the courage of those around her. Where authority faltered, her dignity held. The passengers sensed it. They drew closer, not physically, but in spirit. Strangers minutes before, they were now linked by a common thread. Some clutched their tickets tightly. Others crossed their arms, planting their feet firmly on the ground. One by one, their stances aligned into something immovable. The air thickened with anticipation. Everyone present knew that a line had been crossed. No matter what happened next, the scene had transformed from routine boarding into something indelible, a memory that each person would carry far beyond the walls of the terminal. Authority had pressed, and unity had pressed back. The moment teetered between submission and defiance, between silence and solidarity. And in that fragile balance, The turning point had arrived. The airport had always thrived on routine. The measured rhythm of boarding groups called over loudspeakers, the familiar announcements about tray tables and seat belts, the quiet authority of uniforms and radios. It was a system designed to keep thousands of travelers moving in steady lines, choreography of control where everyone knew their place. But that morning, inside Gate 14, the choreography fractured. The denial of one seat had unsettled more than just a passenger. It had unsettled the illusion that the system was unshakable. The crowd's refusal to disperse, their insistence on standing together, turned the familiar hum of order into a rising current of defiance. The supervisors who arrived wore their authority like armor. Clipboards in hand, radios pressed to their lips, they issued instructions with sharp precision. Yet every directive landed on ground that had shifted beneath them. Passengers no longer responded with obedience, but with resistance. Not loud, not violent, but firm and immovable. When the attendants tried again to call boarding groups, no one moved. The usual shuffle of carry-ons, the eager rush to secure overhead space, it all stalled. Travelers who minutes before had been consumed with connections and itineraries now refused to walk past the CEO who had been denied her rightful place. The boarding gate, once a symbol of order, became a silent standoff. The employees grew restless. Their system depended on compliance, on the idea that passengers valued timeliness above all else. But here, timeliness had lost its throne. Justice had taken its place. The more the staff insisted, the more hollow their commands sounded. Their words carried no weight against the unity of a crowd that had chosen principle over convenience. Radios buzzed urgently. One need escalation. Security to Gate 14? This is disrupting operations. Each clipped message betrayed cracks in the calm facade the airline tried to maintain. The system was designed to handle delays, weather, even emergencies, but it was not built to handle solidarity. The terminal felt the ripple. Other passengers nearby stopped to watch, their own journeys momentarily paused by curiosity and conscience. What was once an isolated incident spread outward, a story unfolding in real time, impossible to ignore. People filmed on their phones, their lenses capturing the scene that authority could not control. The system thrived in silence and anonymity, but now every action was recorded, every raised voice preserved for the world beyond the terminal walls. Inside the gate, the pressure mounted. The attendants, once the face of calm procedure, exchanged anxious looks. Their scripts no longer applied. Passengers would not comply simply because policy required it. Authority, stripped of unquestioned obedience, revealed its fragility. And at the heart of it all, the CEO stood poised, unshaken. She had become the still point around which the chaos swirled, her composure making the system's unraveling even more visible. Her silence contrasted with the staff's frantic movements, her stillness against their nervous pacing. It was not she who looked disruptive, but the very system that had denied her. A man in a suit, once impatient to board, now sat back in his chair with arms crossed, declaring, "I'm not moving until this is fixed." Others followed his lead, grounding themselves like stones in a river. The flow of authority crashed against them but could not move them forward. The boarding gate blinked on its screen, Group 2, Group 3, but no feet moved across the threshold. The airline's machinery, built on efficiency, sputtered to a halt. Time stretched, and with each passing minute, the balance of power shifted further away from the staff and into the hands of the passengers. The system was not designed to fail publicly. It depended on smooth surfaces, on the impression that rules were unshakable. But as the minutes dragged into half an hour, the cracks widened for all to see. Authority tried to tighten its grip, but the harder it pressed, the more it revealed its own weakness. For years, travelers had accepted delays, overbookings, denials, believing them inevitable, part of the cost of flying. But here in this gate, that acceptance dissolved. The people had chosen a different response. They had chosen to resist, and in their resistance, the polished machinery of the airline ground to a halt. The chaos was not loud. It was not violent. It was more dangerous than that. For those in power, in silence is chaos that cannot be dismissed. The image of a united crowd of passengers refusing to board in protest was a disruption no schedule could repair. The system, once so confident in its rules, found itself exposed as fragile, human, and fallible. The standoff at Gate 14 had stretched far beyond inconvenience. 30 minutes had passed, but the weight of those minutes felt heavier than hours. The usual patience of travelers had been replaced with something sharper, something more enduring, a sense that history, in its smallest form, was unfolding before their eyes. Airline supervisors huddled, their voices low but urgent. Radios crackled with updates no one could quite decipher. The system was in disarray. The passengers, resolute in their quiet protest, showed no sign of retreating. Boarding passes remained untouched in their hands. Suitcases rested at their feet. The order of travel had been suspended. Then came the shift. A senior official arrived. A man in a dark suit with polished shoes, his badge glinting under the harsh airport lights. His presence signaled escalation, but also decision. He was not there to negotiate routine. He was there to resolve the fracture that had split the gate in two. His eyes swept the room, reading the fatigue on the attendants, the defiance in the passengers, and the calm resilience of the CEO at the center of it all. For a moment, hung like a curtain. It was the kind of silence that precedes turning points, when every person feels the gravity of what will happen next. The passengers leaned forward, their voices hushed, their phones still raised. The staff braced themselves, their tension visible in the tightening of jaws and the straightening of spines. The official stepped closer to the CEO, who remained still, her boarding pass resting lightly in her hand, her chin held high. The scene carried a weight far greater than the assignment of a seat on a plane. It had become a test of dignity, of recognition, of whether truth could pierce through procedure. He spoke. Low, deliberate, every word carrying the burden of authority. Yet no matter what was said, it was clear this was no longer about the rules of boarding. It was about whether the system could face itself. The CEO's eyes did not waver. She needed no speech, no raised voice. Her presence was her statement, her silence a mirror that reflected the failures around her. The truth was already in the room, undeniable, unshakable. She had earned her place, and she had been denied it. Passengers shifted closer, their bodies forming a protective circle of sorts, not orchestrated but instinctive. They knew they were witnesses, but more than that, they were participants in something larger than themselves. A mother bounced her restless infant gently, whispering, as though to calm not just her child but the very air. The veteran's hand tightened on his cane, his weathered face set with resolve. The student adjusted his backpack straps and stood taller, as though determined not to be overlooked. The official hesitated. His authority was built on rules, yet the crowd's authority was built on truth. And truth, once spoken and shared, has a way of bending even the most rigid structures. Cameras caught every flicker of movement, the narrowing of the official's eyes, the shifting of the attendants, the steadiness of the CEO. The world beyond the terminal was watching through those lenses, though no one knew it yet. Every passenger who held up a phone understood instinctively this was a moment worth preserving, a moment when silence could no longer be mistaken for acceptance. The gate no longer belonged to the airline. It belonged to the people inside it, too, to the conviction that fairness could not be selectively applied. The rules had reached their limit, but the truth had only grown stronger. In that fragile, unguarded moment, the system itself seemed to hesitate. Procedures had failed. Authority had faltered. What remained was the simplest, most unyielding question: would dignity be honored, or would it be denied once more? The air was heavy with expectation. Strangers, once consumed with their own itineraries, now felt bound together in anticipation of what would be decided in the next breath. The hum of the terminal, the distant calls of other flights, even the rolling of suitcases along polished floors, all faded into the background. At Gate 14, everything had narrowed into this single point of reckoning. The moment of truth had arrived. The air at Gate 14 was no longer charged with anger alone, it was alive with the unmistakable pulse of change. What had begun as a confrontation between one woman and a set of procedures had evolved into something far larger, an awakening in the hearts of all who stood witness. The CEO, once isolated in her quiet defiance, now stood as the center of a circle forged not by rules but by solidarity. Her stillness had not diminished her, it had magnified her. She had become a mirror, reflecting back to each passenger the values they longed to see in the world. Courage without arrogance, dignity without demand. As the official lingered, weighing choices against consequences, the crowd itself seemed transformed. People who minutes before had been preoccupied with missed connections and hurried schedules now carried themselves as though history had paused to ask their permission to continue. Each one felt it differently. The mother saw in the moment the kind of world she wanted her child to inherit. The veteran recognized the same spirit of unity he had once felt on foreign soil. The student discovered a strength he did not know he carried. The businessman, who had once measured everything in profit and loss, found himself measuring instead in principles and fairness. This was no longer about a seat, nor even a flight. It had become about recognition, about the transformation that occurs when ordinary people, often unseen and unheard, decide together that silence will not do. The attendants, too, were changed by the moment. Their scripts, once reliable shields against confrontation, felt brittle, insubstantial. They looked not at their clipboards or computer screens, but at the faces before them, faces lit not with rage, but with conviction. For some, it was uncomfortable, even threatening. For others, it was quietly inspiring. A few lowered their gazes, realizing that neutrality had become impossible. The terminal itself seemed altered. The fluorescent lights, usually so cold and unfeeling, now illuminated a kind of stage. The scuffed carpet became a ground of principle. The beeping scanners and rattling suitcases faded into the backdrop of a scene more profound than anyone had expected when they arrived that day. Transformation was not only external, it was internal. The CEO herself felt it, though she had walked into the airport prepared only to travel, to move from one city to another in pursuit of her responsibilities. She had not sought to lead a protest or become a symbol. And yet, they floor, in holding to her dignity with quiet resolve, she had become both. She felt in the weight of the crowd's support a new kind of responsibility. Not to raise her voice, but to carry herself with even greater steadiness, for they had given her their trust without words. The passengers were no longer individuals, they had become a collective force. Not the kind of force that breaks or destroys, but the kind that binds and builds. Strangers glanced at one another with nods of recognition, silent acknowledgments that they had chosen the same side. A shared humanity had broken through the thin walls of anonymity. Even the official in the dark suit felt the shift. Authority had brought him there, but conscience now weighed heavier than policy. His eyes moved from the CEO to the passengers, and something in his posture softened. The transformation was not about defeat or victory. It was about awakening to the reality that rules cannot contain what is right when people decide to stand together. Phones continued to record, their tiny lenses catching not just images but evidence of what happens when systems collide with conscience, when dignity meets delay, when people transform into more than bystanders. There was no music, no grand announcement, but the moment carried its own symphony, the rhythm of voices united, the beat of footsteps shifting in solidarity, the hum of anticipation vibrating through the air. The flight that once defined urgency no longer mattered in the same way. What mattered now was presence. What mattered was that every person there would leave carrying something different than they had brought. A story, a conviction, a memory of transformation that could not be undone. And though the outcome was still undecided, the passengers and the woman at the center of it all had already undergone a change that could not be reversed. When the decision finally arrived, it did not come with the triumphant blare of fanfare or the thunder of applause. It came in the stillness of recognition, in the quiet shift of posture, in the subtle but undeniable reversal of what had been denied. The boarding pass in the CEO's hand was no longer a rejected document. It was acknowledged, accepted, restored to its rightful meaning. The rules had bent, but they had bent in service of justice. Yet the true resolution was not in the seat assignment. It was in the eyes of the passengers who had stood witness, in the changed expressions of those who had chosen to align themselves with truth. The airline official's concession was a single act, but the passenger's awakening was a legacy that would ripple far beyond the polished floor of Gate 14. In the aftermath, people spoke softly to one another, their conversations threaded with relief and admiration. A mother whispered to her child, pointing toward the CEO, not as a victim of injustice, but as a model of grace. The veteran placed his hand gently on the shoulder of the student. a wordless passing of the torch from one generation to the next. Business travelers tapped messages into their phones, not of frustration but of gratitude, capturing the rare feeling of being part of something larger than themselves. Even the staff, though shaken, carried away something unspoken. For some, it was the beginning of a reckoning with their role in systems that too often fail the very people they are meant to serve. For others, it was a quiet vow that the next time such a moment arose, they would choose differently. The CEO, boarding at last, carried no expression of triumph. She carried composure, tempered by the knowledge that victories of dignity are not private. They belong to everyone who dares to claim them. Her presence in that seat, finally recognized, was not about personal comfort, but about collective affirmation. She had not shouted, had not raged, had not demanded. She had simply held fast, and the world around her had shifted. Resolution, in its truest form, is not about erasing the wound, but about ensuring it cannot be repeated in silence. The chaos of that half hour had revealed fractures, but it had also revealed resilience. It has shown that dignity can withstand delay, that truth can withstand pressure, that people, when called upon by conscience, can become greater than their roles. The legacy was already forming. In the days to come, videos would circulate and stories would spread, but even without them, the people at Gate 14 would carry this memory forward into their lives. The mother would tell it to her child as a lesson in courage. The student would recall it as proof that youth need not wait to take a stand. The veteran would share it as another chapter in his lifelong devotion to justice. And the business traveler, who had once measured his world in deals and deadlines, would remember it as the moment he understood that time spent in defense of dignity is never wasted. Legacies are not written by institutions alone, they are written by ordinary people who, when placed in extraordinary circumstances, decide not to look away. At Gate 14, a legacy had been written not in ink or stone, but in the shared will of strangers who refused to allow silence to become complicity. The CEO's story was not the only one. Each passenger had walked into the airport with an itinerary, a personal destination. Each would leave with something they had not expected, a memory that spoke not of travel but of transformation. The chaos that had threatened to derail their journey had instead delivered them into a moment of collective truth. Resolution does not erase what came before. It illuminates it. It gives meaning to the struggle, depth to the waiting, weight to the silence that preceded it, and legacy ensures that what was witnessed does not fade into forgetfulness. At Gate 14, both had been secured, not by design, but by the convergence of courage, patience, and solidarity. The seats on the plane would soon be filled, the flight path cleared, the destination resumed. Yet nothing would be the same as it was before. Something had been restored, and something greater had been set into motion. What happened that day at Gate 14 was never just about a seat. It was about the quiet courage of a leader who chose dignity over anger. It was about the voices of strangers who refused to let silence be mistaken for consent. It was about the power of unity, the reminder that injustice, no matter how small it may appear, is never insignificant when it touches a human soul. The chaos that the airline feared was, in truth, not destruction but awakening. It was proof that ordinary people, teachers, mothers, veterans, students, carry within them extraordinary strength when they choose to stand together. That strength does not live in titles, or uniforms, or positions of authority. It lives in conviction. And the CEO, seated at last in the place she had earned, became more than a passenger. She became a symbol of perseverance and grace, a living testament that dignity cannot be denied when people decide to protect it. This story belongs not only to her, but to all of us. To anyone who has been told to wait, to step aside, to settle for less than what is justly theirs. To anyone who has ever wondered if their voice mattered in the face of indifference. It does. It always does. We are reminded, then, that progress is not born from speeches or policies alone. It is born from moments when ordinary people act with extraordinary conviction. Each of us carries that responsibility. Each of us carries that possibility. And so, when we leave this story behind, let us not leave behind its lesson. Let us carry it with us into our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our schools, and our daily lives. Let us remember that the measure of a community is not how it treats the powerful, but how it defends the dignity of every soul who walks among us. Because, in the end, the true first-class seat is not the one purchased with money. It is the one earned by courage, by respect, by unity. And that seat, my friends, belongs to us all.